Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the Abyss, about books, movies, music I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. This video is going to be about the complicated politics of the goth subculture, and it's partly a response to a video by a guy called It's Goth Dad, who made a pretty interesting video a couple of weeks back about goth and goth subculture called Is Goth Political? It is, but not in the way you think. In this video, I want to talk about what I liked about his video, what I appreciate about it, and then I want to expand it with some of the things about goth culture that I think he missed or skipped over or didn't include that make the whole thing a little more complicated and a little more uncomfortable than people often like to admit. Before I get into it, I should say just briefly about my own relationship to goth and gothic subculture. I, since I was young, have been very interested in a lot of gothic music, gothic literature, gothic art, and I never call myself a goth. I make a joke often that I'm goth adjacent or that I'm a lifetime goth sympathizer. I made this joke to my friend Margot once and she said, "What? You basically are a goth." And I felt very flattered because I always felt growing up when I kind of knew gothic kids in my hometown and saw like goths who were a little older than me, that they were very kind of aspirational to me, but I had never felt that I could go all the way, lean all the way into it. But I do remember vividly for the first time I saw Robert Smith from The Cure on television, feeling very excited and started wearing eyeliner shortly afterwards. It's Goth Dad's video is partly a response to an internet phenomenon of people talking about being right-wing goths or alt-right goths or MAGA goths, and he is arguing that although goth doesn't have explicit politics, it doesn't tell you, what to believe as a subculture. Goth is a subculture more defined by aesthetics in many ways and by literary and artistic references. So it's not as defined politically, but he points out that it comes out of post-punk in the United Kingdom, that it was a reaction to conservative politics, to Thatcherism, to austerity, and that it's always been anti-consumerist, anti-status quo. Additionally, that queerness and particularly gender performance and playing with gender performance has always been an important part of goth communities and goth identity, which means that being kind of anti-trans or anti-queer doesn't really make any sense within the gothic subculture. And I will say that I too felt disgusted when I saw Elon Musk going around with his supposedly gothic MAGA baseball cap. I felt that this was the most disgusting, slimy kind of infiltration of a subculture that he couldn't possibly understand. So I commend It's Goth Dad for his video, and I appreciate somebody going into the implicit politics of the subculture and talking about it, and I think it's timely. However, I think that there are also many uncomfortable aspects of goth culture that have been in the culture from the very beginning. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Siouxsie and the Banshees, who are one of the most iconic goth and post-punk bands, a band I love. Their album Hyena is one of my all-time favourite albums, but they have some difficult history. One of their first ever singles from 1978 was a song called Hong Kong Garden. This is the first verse of the song. Harmful elements in the air, cymbals clashing everywhere, reaps the fields of rice and reeds, while the population feeds. Junk floats on polluted water, an old custom to sell your daughter. Would you like number 23? Leave your yens on the counter, please. A little later in the song, the lyrics are slanted eyes meet a new sunrise, a race of bodies small in size, chicken chow mein and chop suey, Hong Kong Garden takeaway. Now, Siouxsie later on has claimed that this song was a protest song against the skinheads who used to terrorize the people who worked in the local Chinese takeaway shop, which I guess was called Hong Kong Garden. If it is a protest, it's a protest that speaks in the language of the fascists in question. This album, Juju by Siouxsie and the Banshees, is a very iconic goth album. It has the song Halloween on it. It's also got the song Spellbound on it. Many of the songs on this album are kind of post-punk songs with very spooky lyrics. This is before goth really even existed as a genre, but they're kind of one of the bands who are creating it with this album. Spellbound, for example, describes a child whose toys are coming alive at night. All of the songs, or many of the songs, are like almost like horror poems. Now, there's a song on this album called Arabian Nights, and I've thought about this a lot because the song makes me very uncomfortable. On an album of monstrous figures, one of the monsters is some kind of stereotypical Arab sheikh. And the song says things like this: I heard a rumour, it was just a rumour. I heard a rumour, what have you done to her? Myriad lights, they said I'd be impressed. Arabian Nights, at your primitive best. Veiled behind screens, kept as your baby machine, whilst you conquer more orifices of boys, goats, and things, ripped out sheep's eyes, no forks or knives. Myriad lights, they said I'd be impressed. Arabian Nights at your primitive best. I don't really think you can argue that that song is not extremely racist. Around the same time as Siouxsie and the Banshees, another band who were extremely important for goth and for post-punk were coming up. That is Joy Division. Now, interestingly, It's Goth Dad has a Joy Division t-shirt on in the video where he's talking about this. You may know that Joy Division have a controversial name. Their name refers to the area of a concentration camp where Jewish women were kept for sexual slavery. Now, despite the controversial name, Joy Division were not actually fascists. However, Ian Curtis, the very respected and revered vocalist and lyricist of the band, who many goths and post-punk people really revere, he is known to have voted for Margaret Thatcher. This is documented in his wife's book, Touching from a Distance. But that's not really the issue. The issue is that Joy Division's use of fascist aesthetics influenced another band, and that is the band who were originally called Crisis, who were a post-punk anti-fascist band with two members, Douglas Pearce and Tony Wakefield, who went on to form the two most influential Neofolk bands. Neofolk, quick aside, if you don't know what Neofolk is, it is a subgenre of industrial post-punk and goth music that was extremely influential, especially in the German goth scene, but also in parts of the British goth scene, and now internationally is a very significant niche in goth culture. If you want to know more about it, you could do worse than to get this book, which is called Looking for Europe. So Douglas Pearce, from Crisis, went from being a communist anti-racist to being interested in Strausserism, which was a sort of nominally left-wing section of German fascism. And he was interested in this particularly because he's gay, and there was a reasonable gay contingent in the brown shirts. Death in June incorporated samples, music from this era. They wore SS camouflage. They created a whole sort of strange gothic world, which is a kind of mix of Yuko Mishima, Nietzsche, the SS, and homosexuality kind of mixed together in this weird, spooky type of space with very simple music that's sort of surprisingly melodic given the themes. So Douglas P has always staunchly refused to pin down or define the politics of his band Death in June, but he's done benefits for fascist organizations within the Balkans. He's made a lot of pretty dodgy statements over the year, and he stands on stage every day wearing SS camouflage. Douglas P has been the only continuous member of Death in June, but the other central member was Tony Wakefield. And Tony Wakefield went on to form Sol Invictus, who are also very revered and loved by people who like neofolk music, gothic folk, dark folk. And Sol Invictus, much of their music is about the decline of Europe. It's about the end of Europe. It's about the decline of the UK. Even more recent records like Necropolis are about the collapse of London, the end of society. And Tony Wakefield has, I think he might have a Jewish wife now, and he has renounced his political leanings of the past, despite still having this very kind of pessimistic view of Europe. But he was a member of the British National Front. He was an active fascist. Soon I'm going to move on to aspects of goth culture that I think people will recognize more easily or that are slightly more mainstream within goth culture. But before I do that, I want to talk about Boyd Rice. Boyd Rice is mentioned in this book as being one of the key American figures in Neofolk. He's also part of the European goth scene because he's done a lot of work with Douglas P. with Death in June. They made, for example, some albums of very kind of gentle sounding music where Boyd Rice does spoken word over the top, and the flavor of the spoken word texts is kind of hateful. He also wrote a polemic supporting sexual assault in the zine Answer Me, and he said that it was written as a provocation, but that it was based on a fundamental truth. He was close friends with white nationalists, and he's known to have been friends with Charles Manson. He claims to be apolitical, and he's certainly interested in kitsch, but all of his aesthetics throughout the years have been deliberately provocative and deliberately made use of fascist imagery, fascist material. But perhaps the most significant thing is that he's used many times a book called Might is Right by a guy called Ragnar Redbeard, actually Arthur Desmond. And this book is a kind of anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, social Darwinist text. He's used it in music, he refers to it often. And he was very closely involved in the Church of Satan, which is another reason why I'm mentioning Boyd Rice, is that he was supposed to take over the Church of Satan after Anton LaVey, but when Anton LaVey died, there was a kind of schism in the church. Now, many Goths have the Satanic Bible on their bookshelf at home. Some of them may know, and many of them do not, that that book is in large part plagiarized from the book Might is Right, which is a social Darwinist tract arguing that there are no human rights, arguing for the survival of the fittest, is written in the late 1800s. And the other source for much of the Satanic Bible is the works of Ayn Rand. So you might be saying at this point, Vincent, okay, but Boyd Rice is obscure. He's not like a mainstream goth figure. And that's true. But in his connection to the Church of Satan, he was a big influence on Marilyn Manson. They were friends. Marilyn Manson used to write to Boyd Rice before Marilyn Manson even was Marilyn Manson, when he was still Brian Warner. And if you read early interviews with Marilyn Manson where he talks about, for example, why he dresses up as Willy Wonka, he says it's because Willy Wonka was the original social Darwinist, and he likes the idea of social Darwinism a lot early in his career. You hear him talking a lot about it. And what you have here is like a direct line from Neofolk and industrial culture through Boyd Rice to Marilyn Manson of this kind of survival of the fittest, amoral, anti-humanist, anti-human rights type of rhetoric. Marilyn Manson, by the way, also got Neil Strauss to write his autobiography. Neil Strauss, if you don't know him, is a guy who was mostly famous for creating The Game, a strategy for picking up women which involves manipulating them and, for example, negging them, saying something negative to lower their self-esteem so that they'll be more available for you. In the book, The Long, Hard Road Out of Hell, Marilyn Manson's autobiography, actually a fantasy written by Neil Strauss, there are stories about abusing female groupies. I also read interviews with Manson years later where he talked about how he didn't see why anybody would ever get on his tour bus if they didn't want to have sex with him. So as far as he was concerned, boarding his bus was consent. Another example which people never get tired of debating is Type O Negative and Peter Steele. Type O Negative, known as this sort of romantic, sexual, dark, gothic metal band, melodic, have some very, very beautiful songs. Peter Steele, the front figure of the band, was known for making a lot of shocking statements. He was a bit of an edgelord. He would say things about Hitler and Stalin and kind of try and get a rise out of the media and just generally like to break a taboo. But there is a song, like a two-part song on their first record called Der Undermensch, which I think even if you look at their music and some of their content as being humorous and being done for shock value, that song, Der Undermensch, is kind of hard to defend. Like, the lyrics of the song are addressed to people who are in the projects, on benefits, getting social support, and drinking, using drugs. And it talks about wanting to send them back where they came from. It talks about wanting to destroy the projects. It talks about being a socio-parasite, a waste of a life. So send you back where you're from. Get the fuck rid of you subhuman scum. If you don't pay taxes, you shouldn't vote. So get in line and get on the boat. I'd love to tear down on the projects. Kiss my ass. Home relief reject. Is this song written in character from the perspective of kind of right-wing, frothing at the mouth fascist? Maybe, but if it is, that was never terribly clear. And when the band were criticised for this, they made a sort of parody song, a response song called Kill All the White Folks, I think it's called, which was supposed to demonstrate that, you know, you can't consider what they're saying in their songs to be their personal opinions. But even in Kill All the White Folks, they're doing, at the end, a kind of impersonation of a black guy. So my point here is not necessarily that Typo Negative were terrible people or that Peter Steele is cancelled. It's more that Goth's openness for the breaking of taboo can allow some material that makes its politics quite confusing and at times a little disturbing. We could ask the question whether Goth's embrace of taboo aesthetics and its tolerance for shock value might, in some cases, allow fascist ideas to go unchecked. In the case of Death in June, for example, it may not really be relevant whether Douglas P. actually is a fascist. I think he is, personally, but the question might be moot. My friend Armando, he's a big Death in June fan. He went to see them twice in Portugal in the 90s. He said the first time the place was full of Goths. The second time, the venue was full of fascists. At a more general level, Goth has a certain elitism. It has a certain aristocratic pose that's kind of baked into the subculture. I think about Oscar Wilde, who on the one hand is a sort of progressive figure because he's a figure of gay liberation and of art, but on the other hand is kind of staunchly amoral. We should also think about the fact that Goth has predominantly been a white subculture, and any subculture built by white people will replicate the problems of white society, even if it attempts to be against the status quo, even if it positions itself as a critique. One of these structural issues is not being honest about uncomfortable aspects of our culture or society, and we don't often enough interrogate the extent to which extremely unpleasant, problematic, and alienating aspects of culture also infiltrate goth art, culture, and spaces. The good news is that goths are very good at gatekeeping. Goths will tell other goths that they are not goths all the time. Every new generation of goths is not considered to be a real goth. People who like Marilyn Manson in the 90s were not considered to be goths then. They are considered to be goths now. Emos were not considered to be goths. People who were into emo trap were not considered to be goths. Goth is a continually evolving subculture, and each new version is always rejected initially. So goths are very good at gatekeeping, and I think if you want to gatekeep anyone, you want to gatekeep the type of people that It's Goth Dad is talking about. Goth as a subculture is kind of a paradox. It's inclusive of difference at the same time as it has rigid norms of aesthetics and cultural practice. It's aristocratic at the same time as it's progressive. I like the idea that it is a refuge for the weirdos of the world, and I think that anything that threatens its inclusivity in that respect is to be opposed, which is why I think it's good if we talk about how complex its politics actually have been and how we would like them to look. I hope this video has been interesting to you. Like and subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me, and I'll see you again soon.